Hello everyone. Today we're discussing how the off-payroll rules that come into force on the 6th of April 2021 affect MSPs, RPOs, master and neutral vendors. I'll generally refer to these types of arrangements as MSP arrangements just for convenience, but this guidance does cover any Tier 1 intermediary in the supply chain. You'll know from the other content on this portal what clients need to be doing in terms of IR35 status assessments and issuing status determination statements, etc. And that process doesn't change regardless of the existence of an MSP. So clients will be making tax status assessments for any PSC contractors who are providing services to them, whether those PSCs are supplied directly by you as the MSP or by a second-tier agency. And the clients will be passing the outcomes to you as the next party in the chain, as well as the individual PSC workers. You must pass the SDS to your second-tier agencies, and where the determination is that of an inside IR35, it is the agency closest to the PSC, and the legislation refers to this party as the fee payer. It is that party who needs to ensure a pay-as-you-earn compliant payment mechanism is used to pay the PSC for any work performed on or after the 6th of April 2021. For many contractors within your MSP arrangements, that means the second-tier agency is the fee payer, because that is the agency, they are the agency who is closest to the PSC. It's only where you supply the client with PSCs that are directly payrolled by you that you would be the fee payer. Each party in the chain is legally liable for any non-compliance, including any tax, unpaid tax and national insurance, unless and until they have completed their obligations. So in theory, MSPs are better protected than second-tier agencies, since your only obligation is to pass the SDS to the next agency in the chain. But actually, there is increased risk to MSPs under separate secondary legislation to the off-payroll rules. HMRC are implementing transfer of liability provisions that can make you responsible for the tax and national insurance shortfall if your second-tier agency doesn't comply with its obligations to deduct pay-as-you-earn. I should note that we haven't yet had the final wording of this secondary legislation, but it's unlikely to change from the proposed draft version. So let's take a look at this liability transfer in a bit more detail. This slide assumes there is a second-tier agency in the chain, since if it's a direct placement, you'll already be the fee payer, as we've already discussed. If an assignment is deemed outside IR35, then you as the MSP only need to ensure that the second-tier agency has received the SDS from you. If the client hasn't taken reasonable care with the determination, the client is liable. If the client has taken reasonable care, but the outcome of an individual assessment is wrong for some reason, then it's the fee payer who is held liable. If an assignment is deemed inside IR35 and the second-tier agency, that is the fee payer, fails to pay the PSC using a pay-as-you-earn compliant model, then it is the fee payer who is primarily liable. But if the fee payer chooses not to use a pay-as-you-earn compliant model, and then when HMRC investigates it ceases to exist or dissolves, HMRC will be able to pursue the MSP for the tax and national insurance liabilities, even if there are other agencies in the chain between you and the fee payer. If for any reason HMRC cannot collect the transferred debt from you as the MSP, then they will pursue the end client. So these transfer provisions could mean that despite you doing nothing wrong, you could be responsible for covering the tax shortfall for many of the PSC contractors supplied by that fee-paying agency to your client via your MSP. And that is potentially an enormous liability. The transfer of liability is most likely to occur in the situation I've just described. That is, where assignments have been deemed inside IR35 and the fee payer hasn't properly deducted pay as you earn before making payment to the contractor. The best way to mitigate this risk is to ensure that any PSC contractors deemed inside IR35 are converted to a pay-as-you-earn compliant umbrella or an agency pay-as-you-earn arrangement before the 6th of April 2021, and any new assignments for the same role aren't offered to PSC contractors in the future. And then you will need to carry out audits on your second-tier agencies to ensure they're following that approach. For any contractors who need to convert to umbrella, you may prefer to dictate to your second-tier agencies which umbrellas can be used based on your own due diligence, rather than allow your second-tier agencies to choose their own umbrella-approved supplier list. However, the transfer of liability provisions could also affect you for assignments that are deemed outside IR35, though this scenario does have a lower probability of occurring and possibly a lower impact overall, but it is still worth considering. You'll know from other content on this portal of the fee payer risk. So that's where a client has discharged its duty of reasonable care, but the outcome of a few individual assessments are just wrong. So a client issues an SDS that is outside IR35, all the parties in the chain follow that SDS, but it later transpires the outcome of that assessment was wrong and the assignment should actually have been deemed inside IR35. Where that's the case, it's the fee payer who's liable for the unpaid tax and national insurance, not the client. It's unlikely that the client will get many assessments wrong, because the more incorrect assessments, the more likely it is that the client will not have discharged its duty of reasonable care. But it's certainly likely that a small number of assessments will have the wrong outcome, and particularly within large client businesses where they have lots of PSCs and lots of roles. And of course, it's those types of clients who generally engage MSPs. So where a few assessments have been wrongly determined by the client, the fee payer, the second-tier agency, they are the one who is primarily liable for the unpaid tax and national insurance. If the liabilities are significant, and of course they can reach tens of thousands of pounds per contractor per tax year, then the fee payer may dissolve to avoid paying those liabilities. Then the transfer provisions can be used to pursue you as the MSP instead. The more you can do, therefore, to ensure that any assignments deemed inside IR35 are properly managed by your second-tier agencies, and ensure that your client isn't making any outside IR35 determinations that are wrong, the better protected you and the rest of the supply chain will be. It's also worth noting that if you work with a second-tier agency that is based outside the UK, then you, as the agency closest to the PSC that is based onshore, that is within HMRC's jurisdiction, you become the fee payer, because the legislation wording ensures that no non-UK agency can be a fee payer. Therefore, you must make the deductions for any tax and national insurance yourself before you pay the second-tier agency, and that can get really complicated. So if you do work with any international second-tier agencies for UK placements, I'd really recommend that any PSC contractors deemed inside IR35 are converted to an alternative payment mechanism, such as a pay-as-you-earn compliant umbrella. So those are the main kind of liability and debt provisions covered, but there are some more practical considerations for MSPs as well that I just want to run through quickly. First of all, if you don't currently track the supply or payroll mechanisms of your tertiary supplied contractors right now, you really need to start, because you'll need to know the payment mechanism for all contractors that sit under the MSP in order to know which contractors are affected by the off-payroll rules. And clients will be asking you for that information because they need to know which roles to assess. And if you, as the MSP, don't have access to that information immediately, it doesn't look very good on you. Because of the liability transfer mechanisms, you will need to know that your second-tier agencies know about the new rules and how to comply. You could end up being liable for their mistakes, so ensuring they understand their obligations is really important. So make sure you include any second-tier agencies into your communications planning. I would also recommend ensuring that your second-tier agencies use your contractor communications rather than using their own. There's nothing worse than having two contractors on the same site for the same client receiving different messaging or positioning. So ensuring all contractors receive the same information at the same time is really important. Before the new rules go live, you will need to have a process agreed for sending on SDSs. Make sure you know which email address to send the SDS onto for the second-tier agency, or if you're using a portal of some kind, make sure the second-tier agency has a login and is notified when any new SDSs are released. You'll need to make sure that whatever discussions you're having with your client and decisions that your client is making are promptly communicated to your second-tier agencies so that they know what's going on as well. You also need to think about what you are going to do and your client is going to do for any assignments that are deemed inside IR35. And as soon as you know what's going to happen, you need to make sure your second-tier agencies understand and can comply with the proposed processes. So, for example, if you've agreed with your client that your supply chain will offer an option to make deemed direct payments, that is, where the fee payer continues to pay the PSC but makes the necessary deductions for tax and national insurance first, then you need to check that your second tiers can facilitate that. Don't forget that agencies aren't required to offer this payroll option, and in fact most agencies won't offer deemed direct payments because the process is really quite complicated. It's far more difficult than standard pay-as-you-earn. You'll also need to agree with your client whether charge and pay rates will change and how. Some clients might agree to increased charges to cover some of the statutory uplifts or to offset the contractor's reduced take-home pay. Any such amendments to charge rates, pay rates and second-tier margins will of course need to be communicated and contractual changes made. Now is also a good time to consider if you're happy with your current supply chain partners, and it's a good opportunity to do a review of all of your second tiers. You need to be really confident that tertiaries won't ignore your client's determination and just pay all their PSCs gross and then just dissolve if they're investigated by HMRC at a later date, because HMRC will then pursue you under the transfer of liability provisions we've already talked about. If you have second-tier agencies that you need in your supply chain, but you have concerns about their compliance processes, perhaps you could consider a margin-only arrangement or something similar. So you as the MSP, you pay the PSC, and you simply pay the second-tier agency their margin. And that way you can ensure compliance with any tax obligations. It does increase your admin and, of course, your working capital, but I would argue it's much less of a disruption than getting the second-tier agency's tax bill. It gives you more control and therefore less risk. You'll also need to think about and make amendments to your contracts with your second-tier agencies, and some of the areas you'll want to include are here on this slide. It's important to remember that the entire contractual chain needs to support IR35 status, particularly those deemed outside IR35, because really it's only those assignments that HMRC are going to investigate in the future. HMRC does review all of the contracts in the supply chain when they are looking at and investigating IR35 status. So just make sure that your contract with your second tier agencies, and of course with any direct contractors as well, supports an outside IR35 status. The contracts alone won't decide that an assignment is outside IR35, but they can certainly help to put an assignment inside IR35. It's common in PSC contracts to include lots of indemnities in your favour, but it is worth noting that an indemnity won't protect you against the liability transfer provisions, since the only real reason why HMRC can't collect the liability from the fee payer, that is the second tier agency, is because that agency has dissolved. And if that's the case, there is no legal entity for you to enforce the indemnities against. They'll be worthless. It really is better to manage the risks to you under the transfer of liability provisions via process and audits of your second tier agencies rather than rely on contractual provisions that simply won't help you. In relation to your contractor contracts, I would suggest having your contracts with PSCs who are deemed outside IR35, have them reviewed by an IR35 expert to ensure that they genuinely support that status. I'd also recommend that you require your second tier agencies to use your outside IR35 contractor contract template so that you can be sure that the full contract chain supports that status without having to review all of your second tier agencies' templates. Those are the main considerations for any Tier 1 agencies. I really hope you found the information useful, and thank you for watching.